Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host Nathan P. Butler, and this is kind of a weird episode in that it's looking at something that is essentially inspired by home video items, but which are not home video items themselves. So if that's not your cup of tea, might want to move along at this point. Also kind of an interesting thing in that to some degree you could argue that this episode is kind of a crossover, a little bit, with the series that inspired it. Some of you may know that before this series started in August of 2013, I actually had another series going under a similar name. This is From the Star Wars Home Video Library. Before that, though, starting in 2012, I had another series called From the Star Wars Library. No home video in there. Now, you might remember that back before you had the home video library set up back here, it was Star Wars books, right? Because until I sold most of it off to make room for more Star Wars home video stuff, I had an almost complete or pretty close to complete Star Wars book and comic library. It was first versions of each, or first formats of each. So I didn't have like every variant of a comic, but I would make sure that if it was released individually, originally as single issues, not as trade paperbacks, I'd have the single issues. Not necessarily every different type of cover, but at least one copy, and so on and so on. If it was a novel, I'd have like the first format it was in, as early as I could, not necessarily a first printing, and so on and so on. But I had pretty much a complete collection, if you don't count RPG material, which I consider sort of a separate thing. And when it came down to it, there was just not enough space. As this started filling up with home video stuff, I sold that off. But at the time, in 2012, I was still working on the Star Wars Timeline Gold, StarWarsFanWorks.com/timeline, if you want to see where it ended up after nearly 21 years when I retired from it. But I was working on the Star Wars Timeline Gold. I was still very seeped in the Legends continuity in particular, which at the time was the Star Wars continuity. And I had that giant book and comic collection. And I thought, you know what? I'll do a series on YouTube, kind of going into this stuff, play off the listenership of the podcast that I was involved with, or that I had done even previously, like Chrono Radio, play off of, my interest in things like that, and do a show about that stuff. So it was actually a series that looked at Star Wars books and comics in publication order. Of course, then came the reboot, and that kind of content became a lightning rod for douchebags online, and it became just not worth it to continue with that series, especially as this series from the Star Wars Home Video Library started really gathering steam. So that series basically kicked off in October of 2012. It ran through the entirety of the Marvel Comics comic run and some offshoots of that. It ran through the early stuff coming from Del Rey in novel form. Eventually I got through all 6 of the Trioculus Saga books, all of the Thrawn trilogy, and into the first Dark Empire comic series. And then it stopped, because it was just, again, kind of a lightning rod to do anything like that. So it ended in June of 2014, whereas this series then continued and grew and grew and grew, eventually spawning a saga on home video, first edition, second edition, and so on. Just kind of grew and grew and grew from there. What that means is that one of the earliest things, or at least one of the things, that was covered by that old series was the content of the novelizations of the 3 original trilogy films and their comic adaptations from Marvel Comics. Skip forward many years, as I'm doing From the Star Wars Home Video Library, and among other things, as I'm collecting Star Wars home video stuff, I'm finding stuff that is inspired by the look or the theme of home video releases that aren't necessarily home video items themselves, like those Funko t-shirts and whatnot. And I was reminded, and it kind of slipped my mind, I guess I never really kind of thought about it for years, I was reminded by Justin Richard that actually there were some tie-in items that were reprints of those old adaptations, novelizations and comic adaptations, that were based on the 1995 Faces design for the THX Remastered Edition in the US. So that's what we want to look at this time around. We want to look at, very quickly, the adaptations that use that cover art that essentially were used to help sort of cross-promote the adaptations with the THX Remastered Edition in 95. Again, only in the US though, because in other regions the cover art was very different. As to the actual home video release, this is one of them. We've looked at quite a few different versions of this over the years, different regions, including the US. This is the full screen brick. We looked at the 2 different widescreen editions. We've seen this one actually with Spanish subtitles from the US, but easiest probably just to grab this brick to remind us of what these looked like. So this is the 1995 THX Remastered Edition. Again, based on what we saw in the definitive collection in '93, which is when the THX remastering process was done. New covers, and these have these new Leonard Maltin interviews, that 3-part interview about the films that are included before each film on these cassettes. Cover-wise, remember, A New Hope here. You have the Star Wars, the poster image, or the faces image created for this. You have Seen at the bottom, the THX stuff down here in blue. We have a purple theme for Empire, but a similar design. And then you have a reddish, kind of maroonish almost, theme for Return of the Jedi here. Well, as part of that cross-promotion in 1995, the novelizations were re-released with covers with dust jackets that resembled those VHS packages, all of which include new introductions written by George Lucas himself. Notice here the A New Hope art, kind of made a little bit more wide, is put here on this novelization. Okay, this is coming from Del Rey Publishing here. We have George Lucas. Again, as always, it helps to remember that this was a novelization first published in 1976 before the film came out, and it was not actually written by George Lucas. It was ghost written by Alan Dean Foster, who went on to do things like The Approaching Storm. Okay. Notice down here, similar design, no THX stuff, but it does say with a new introduction by George Lucas. You look at the back. Information about the book itself. For what it's worth, it says, the world's first glimpse of Star Wars happened with little fanfare as the first edition of the novel sold modestly. It wasn't until the official tie-in version of the book that it sold millions of copies and broke records, much like the film was doing in theaters. In a way, the original book performed as I expected the film to do. A respectable showing, certainly nothing to set the world on fire, but hopefully enough to allow me to follow up with the further stories in the saga. Happily, Star Wars exceeded my expectations. From the new introduction by George Lucas. You got your info, of course, as usual, on either side of the dust jacket. Again, crediting Lucas, not Alan Dean Foster, as the writer here, as has been typically the case with this one. Again, it's just the novelization. It's that great novelization that includes that ending line, that quote from Leia, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Naturally, they became heroes. If you want to learn more about this novelization, feel free to check out that earlier series of mine, all the videos of which are still up on YouTube. The video quality, the audio quality are pretty much shit. I'm not going to lie. Most of my early stuff was recorded on a webcam that was just garbage, with some pretty garbage lighting, but that was mostly the webcam's fault, not the room's fault and whatnot. In fact, I kind of made a joke about it in most of the episodes. But you can find information about the adaptation in From the Star Wars Library, episode number 1. We started out with the first thing that had been published. This is just the 1995 version of the same. I guess before we move on, I should show you guys the spine there. Star Wars, it does have A New Hope there and on the back, just not on the front. George Lucas, Del Rey, a Del Rey book, Valentine Books. And if you're curious, it is essentially gold lettering there for Star Wars, A New Hope, George Lucas, Del Rey, slightly differently designed than the other spine on the inside. Also carrying on with the theme of carrying over the artwork, there was a novelization re-release of The Empire Strikes Back by Donald F. Glut. Notice there, this is based on a story by George Lucas, and the screenplay listed there as well, so credit where due. Spine, right there. Does have Donald F. Glut, based on a story by George Lucas there on the side. Similar bottom, similar setup here with the very long title going across. Similarly designed back, from the new introduction by George Lucas. As the middle act in a 3-act play, Empire by its nature was a challenging story for a single film. When I wrote the original Star Wars screenplay, I knew that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. The audience did not. I always thought that this revelation, when and if I got the chance to make it, would be shocking, but I never expected the level of emotional attachment that audiences developed for Luke as a symbol of goodness and Vader as the embodiment of evil. Or should I say, evil. Similar setup here. It does have the actual author there, Donald F. Glut. Actually, first printings of each of these still sitting in my collection. I have a first printing of the original novelization. I've got the first Sci-Fi Book Club hardback from the original novelization that is signed by Anthony Forrest, who played Fixer. I've got let's see, it is a paperback omnibus of all three novelizations signed by Alan Dean Foster, who I've met in person. I have a signed numbered copy of the original Empire Strikes Back novelization, first printing from Donald F. Glut. And I don't think I have a James Caan signed Return of the Jedi. I don't think. I just still have the first printing of it sitting around somewhere, though. In any event, there is Empire. And to finish out that matching set with the THX Remastered Edition artwork was Return of the Jedi here. And James Caan, similar setup here. Again, the new introduction by Lucas being listed there. There's the spine. There's the back. And the back reads, again from the new introduction by Lucas, more than either of the prior two films, Jedi gave me the opportunity to explore philosophical issues of great interest to me. One theme central to the trilogy is that the potential for goodness and evil exists within each person, and is realized only by the choices that we each make. In Jedi, the theme remained the same as the simplest of natural forces brought down the seemingly invincible weapons of the evil empire. Again, similar setup here. James Caan there. I guess I should show you, again, without the cover, but it's going to be a similar design here. Lots of space taken up there. That bigger print as far as that goes. There you go. So if it's 1995, you're inspired by the THX Remastered Edition, you really are enjoying that, you see these on the shelves, it might entice you to buy these books that had come out in 76, 80, and 83, which are decent enough novelizations of the films, though certainly it has its differences. You know, in early printings, Yoda was said to be blue, for example. Obviously, there's a lot of differences in dialogue and things like that. That is why back in the original tiered sort of Legends continuity, these tended to come below the films, yet still because they were based on Lucas's ideas above the rest. Sort of a sub-tier within what we referred to at the time as G canon, minus anything that was introduced by later authors. So we have those, and if you're looking for Empire and Jedi coverage, I already mentioned A New Hope's coverage. If you want to see my thoughts on the actual novelization, was back in From the Star Wars Library, Episode 1. You can find the novelization of Empire in Episode 30. You can find the novelization of Return of the Jedi in Episode 72. The ones on A New Hope and Empire were from 2012. It was January of 2013 when I hit the Return of the Jedi one. So still predating this series by about 7 months for the latest of these episodes. Where it gets more interesting is in the comic adaptations. So the original comic adaptation of A New Hope actually came through Marvel Comics in their original run of 107 issues, which of course then had 3 annuals and the Return of the Jedi miniseries. But for A New Hope and for Empire, there were actually just runs of issues in the regular series that made up the adaptation. For A New Hope, they got reprinted. They got collected over and over again over the years, but they got reprinted here. Once Dark Horse Comics had the license, they reprinted it, calling it Classic Star Wars a few times. And then in 95, you get this trade paperback version of it. Again, very similar in style to the VHS cases, which are also similar to the Laserdisc cases, but they're wider. And on the bottom here, or jackets, it says the comic book adaptation. Interestingly, comic book has a dash or a hyphen. Not sure why that needs to be the case. This is by Roy Thomas, and so on, but it's just the original adaptation, you know, updated colors and whatnot. It's not a great adaptation, again, because of when it was being made in relation to the film actually being produced. That tends to be the case with adaptations, but especially for this one, it would be supplanted in 97 by a special edition adaptation that more closely resembles a special edition version of the film. You can see my thoughts on the original version of this from Marvel Comics in From the Star Wars Library, Episode 2 from 2012. The back here is your text there. I'm not going to read all the text for these, but we have some crawl-type text about it, film name, or series name in this case, Dark Horse Comics, and then your UPC stuff. Notice there's a UPC barcode in the white box. The text to go with it on top and bottom are just there against the background of the image itself, not any colors at all. It's just text, no like boxes to put it in. That will matter in a moment. The spine there just says Classic Star Wars, again, using the name that Dark Horse put it out under most of the time, A New Hope, Dark Horse Comics. And full disclosure, fan of the Dark Horse era, wrote the one time for the Dark Horse era with Star Wars Tales 21 Equals and Opposites. So I don't think that has any bearing on my enjoyment or lack of enjoyment of these, but still. So if you want to check out that one, again, it's episode 2. If you want to check out The Empire Strikes Back, there was a trade paperback version of this as well, marketed as Classic Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. I cover the original Marvel adaptation, which is just, again, recolored and reprinted here in its entirety in episode 32 of From the Star Wars Library. Similar design, but notice they're not really deviating, even when they need to show something, at least on the front. Even when they have other information to provide, they're providing it exactly where that THX bar would be, so you still have this colored bar underneath to really kind of keep that theme visually going. And these, unlike the novels, don't have a bunch of extra text up here, so they very, very closely resemble the VHS cassettes, which is something I find kind of nice. This one being by Archie Goodwin, by the way. Then, for Marvel, Return of the Jedi got its own 4-issue miniseries. The other 2 adaptations were 6 issues each. Jedi just got 4, but it was a separate miniseries outside the regular 107-issue run. Collected here as Classic Star Wars Return of the Jedi from Dark Horse. And Classic Star Wars Return of the Jedi being what it says there on the side. I guess I should note there it does have the Dark Horse, well, Knight up there at the top for any of these. Same setup here, looking very much like the VHS. Again, by Archie Goodwin. You can see my coverage of the original miniseries of this in From the Star Wars Library number 73. Now, you would expect, typically, that if you were going to see a trilogy of comic adaptations of something, whether they have VHS-related covers or not, you would typically expect to see those in some type of boxed set. Maybe. Not all the time, but if they were going to do a box set, it would make sense to do it for things like this, where a series is collected. Well, just like you had a Darth Vader cover here for the VHS set, they did a Darth Vader cover for a collected comic set. However, it's basically what in comics are referred to as a virgin cover. In other words, no text on it whatsoever. It's just a clean image there. No Star Wars trilogy, THX, or anything like that here. Okay, so that image taken straight from the A New Hope VHS case. Dark Horse, continuation or repeat of the image there. I guess it's a continuation technically. Yeah, his face is like bent over. Then continuation of that art there. So just Dark Horse really on this side. Nothing to indicate what it actually is if you're sitting it on a shelf like this. Then the back, you have the logos for each. The images of the VHS covers, which are also the comic covers here of each. Then down here it says the comic book adaptations, plural. Right? So that is carried over, but it's on the back. And notice here, this version has the barcode here, and it does have the other information, except the other information is in its own box that sort of grows out of the barcode box here. Inside, you would expect that you would simply find just these all over again. Instead, it's a different design, slightly. We'll start with A New Hope here, as we typically would. The spines, first of all, have been redone so they're not the solid color of this bit on the bottom, so they're much, much easier to read. Okay? It still says Classics, it has a Dark Horse symbol, Classic Star Wars, A New Hope, Dark Horse Comics there, but it's much easier to read with that sort of white on sort of dark blue or black there. The back has the text, has the logo, Dark Horse Comics logo, and then your barcode here, but again, the barcode is done slightly differently here, in that it does have the boxes on top and bottom. I would also note that whereas it's kind of hard to see, but on the originals they had that background here, like a space generic background. It was kind of like reddish maroon and kind of dark. And then for Empire and Jedi, they were sort of like different variations of brownish. Here, For all of them, it's basically just blue. So it's a blue on black, a much more subtle type of color scheme there. But then the front still has Star Wars, still has the comic book adaptation, still has that same image, but instead of being a full shot image that more closely matches what we saw with the THX Remastered Edition, it shrinks it down into the box with the other border around it. So it's still the art from the THX Remastered Edition that was created for that product line, but it isn't a full shot here. So it's a variation of that. Otherwise, it is effectively the same. And we will find the same thing here with Empire. Notice still keeping the right color scheme as far as the titles go and the bar along the bottom, even the title on the back, getting the correct color scheme. And then Jedi. It's all same setup here. Interestingly, the lines of extra text that actually get boxes behind them on the barcode actually do match the color of the text. You notice there. So you can get the 3 trade paperbacks of the comic adaptations either individually or in a box set, but the box set actually has 2 variations at least that I have found. And comic folks, let me know. It's been a long time since I've looked at this, and honestly, I didn't keep track of different printings even when I was collecting this stuff very often, especially for trade paperback stuff. So my guess is one of these is from 95, the other might be a reprint in 96, but you can't really tell just looking at the copyright dates on the material itself, and neither of them have anything on the top or bottom that would indicate it. But here is a second version of the same thing. Almost the same thing. Same kind of cover based on the THX Remastered Edition, same kind of spine here, same setup to the back essentially, except notice here, we're back to having the barcode with the information on top and bottom, but no colored box around it. Also, I would say this is a fairly yellowed barcode box, although the rest of it doesn't seem to be particularly faded, so it's hard to tell whether that was originally that color or if it has actually faded on this particular version of it. But when you actually look at the films inside, the comic adaptations of the films, notice there is a slight difference. What is missing? The colored bar at the bottom that was meant to somewhat match up with the THX bar at the bottom of the VHS cassettes and, I guess, the Laserdiscs, is gone at this point here. This version of it does not have that. Also, I would say, of interest here, is the fact that while this is the same, the back has been slightly reorganized because the individual barcode has been removed, because I guess you wouldn't need it if it's in a box set, right? And down goes the Dark Horse symbol here, where it says a Dark Horse Comics collection. And then it is a similar design here for Empire and for Jedi. I didn't mean for this to be a super, super long episode by any means, especially since what we're covering here is technically not home video items in and of themselves. But I thought that this would be an interesting time to take a look at these, given the fact that, Justin Richard had just brought them back to my attention, and Matthew Hardesty kind of nudged me saying, maybe it's time to get these. And I did actually have some of these in my collection at one point. But I do find it interesting that every great once in a while, it's not very often, you actually see instances of products that are released to help promote or coincide with a Star Wars film release on home video, in this case 3 films as a trilogy set, or individually, I guess you could have bought them individually at the time, where the products that aren't home video actually match in design to the home video stuff. You do not see that very often. Typically, it's just that maybe the same artwork is used over and over again that we see on the early, say, A New Hope releases or the early Empire and Jedi releases. But it's not because it's home video art being reused, it's that the home video is using existing poster art to go from there. These weren't theatrical posters, these were pieces of art created for the THX Remastered Edition, as far as I know, that were then used across these other product lines to help promote it and draw in sales at the time that we were seeing that release that was very heavily promoted, remember, as see the original one last time. Back when we were being told that A New Hope was going to get a special edition, so if you wanted to get the original version of A New Hope, the original film, you would need to get the THX Remastered Edition, but we had not yet been told at the time that Empire or Jedi would be getting special editions. It was a weird time to be a Star Wars fan, particularly a Star Wars fan who is a collector of stuff on home video or tied into it. So I just wanted to show you those. Thought it was kind of a nifty little thing, and as we are running out of things to show in terms of official releases that are in my collection that I haven't shown in the 400 plus previous episodes of this series, I thought it'd be cool to show these that are now part of my collection as sort of an offshoot of the home video stuff, and to remind you of that old series of mine with the horrible lighting for those who are interested in going back and checking out those episodes. Again, the A New Hope novelization was episode 1, the A New Hope comic adaptation was episode 2, the Empire novelization, episode 30, Empire comic adaptation, 32, Jedi novelization, 72, Jedi comic adaptation 73, the first 4 of those being from 2012, the other 2 being from 2013. Again, a series that lasted from October of 2012 through June of 2014 when the reboot effectively killed it and my focus turned to this series, which actually had premiered in August of 2013. Just to give you that fun context here for the channel, for those of you who have watched me in recent years when the lighting doesn't suck as much and it's HD and so on. Yes, there was a From the Star Wars Library series that existed before this one, that I've taken my notes for here, that did feature the stories of these if you're curious on my thoughts on those. So an interesting, weird little crossover here as we're nearing the end of 2022, a year with almost no new Star Wars home video releases to speak of, especially not in the United States. With that, we will wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching. May the Force be with the home video viewers, and may the Force be with the readers.